Dear friend, pay attention that in the description of this podcast episode, you will find the link to download the free beginner's guide to reverse auctions. Hello and welcome to Future Procurement. My name is Robert Freeman and I want to start by saying a big thank you to each listener of this podcast. We are soon reaching the point of 5,000 listeners worldwide, and this is really exciting. And today is a very important day for me as a host of this podcast for other reason, that we finally have a Skype together with Alun Rafique from Great Britain. Hello, Alun.
Hi there.
I'm very happy to have you as a guest at our podcast, and we were having a short pre-talk. Today you have also a very busy agenda, and thank you for finding time to talk to us. And probably the main topic will be eSourcing today, right?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for having me, and I guess an upcoming happy Christmas to each of your listeners as well.
Thank you. But before we really jump into the eSourcing and into your current activities, can you share a little bit of your background and of your story, how you came into the place where you are now?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is aeronautical engineering. I used to work for Rolls-Royce as an engineer on the military side in Bristol. I studied in Bristol. And it was whilst there on a graduate training scheme that I fell into procurement. I like the technical and the commercial side. And after that, I kind of moved over to PwC, did some consultancy in procurement, working for the MOD. And then I went to sell engineering simulation software around Europe. And that was very, very interesting because I got to sell, all things like fluid dynamics simulation, finite element analysis, all across the Benelux, Iberia, and in the UK. So I got experience of engineering, consultancy, sales, software, and it was back then when I decided to move into selling managed auctions, because I always thought auctions were a great way for companies to save money on the reverse auction side. So reverse auction, for those who don't know, is where you look to buy something and suppliers provide prices for your goods or services, and they compete with each other, and so the price decreases over time. And we sold that as a managed service, and we realized that when I was there at this boutique consultancy, that there was in fact times had moved on. Auctions had been around for the last 20 years, and there was an appetite for people to do these themselves. And so we developed Market Dojo as a company to sell pay-as-you-go, on-demand e-auctions to a wider audience, and that's how Market Dojo was born. Really, we saw, myself and another colleague there and another colleague from I knew from since university, we realized that we could develop a self-service solution for reverse auctions, and then the Market Dojo was born, and the rest is history.
Was it 2010 if I remember correctly?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we came up with the name Market Dojo. Dojo means place of the way in Japanese, and so we can roughly translate it, we hope, as a way to market. So Market Dojo is a way to market. And then for myself and Nick, Drew and Nick Martin are the other co-founders. One's got a firm background in procurement, the other one in technology, and so we made a very good fit together.
Interesting. So since that time, since 2010, you are developing this further and further.
Yeah, we're still here, which is nice. We've been growing steadily and relatively rapidly the last 7 years. We very much focus on eSourcing. We haven't branched into P2P. In the last 7 years, we've really developed a strategic sourcing framework from supplier onboarding, general sourcing, reverse auctions, innovation, opportunity analysis. And we interface with partners such as Parangusta for contract management, savings tracking, pipeline management. And so we work on several different levels, either an on-demand level, very unique in the market on that, or as an enterprise level. And our clients range from companies with 2 million turnover through to FTSE companies. We've got six FTSE companies on our books, where 30% of our revenue comes from outside of the UK. And recently we've had some very interesting developments in terms of projects. One, to help companies manage the tail spend, which is due to be as a quick quote product, a quotation portal for helping procurement people to look outside of the core procurement area into people in the organization. And we've already sold that, and it is not released yet. And we're also working on a marketplace for manufacturing for the purchasing of raw materials. So what we're doing is we're taking eSourcing and innovating within that space rather than move into P2P or anything like that.
Interesting. So if we can stop a little bit on eSourcing, and if you can show us the way that has passed from what I still remember in my practice, having emails and spreadsheets to run the quotations, to run the competitive bidding and sourcing activities, to where we are now, or to the future where we are heading. I mean, what has changed and what is ahead of us?
Very, very interesting. So 20 years ago, I was at Rolls-Royce, and they had an SAP implementation to help people move away from email. Yeah. Fast forward 20 years on, email is still the primary source of sourcing within many companies. Even companies with eSourcing still do a lot of the quotations via email. The problem about email is obviously a lack of centralization. You send a quote out, a tender out to 3 suppliers. They all have different questions, all have different spreadsheets. You get a raft of information, difficult to manage. And not very scalable. So the solution is, well, you send the tender to less suppliers and you get less good results and less savings. I'm a massive fan in trying to drive eSourcing adoption. However, at the moment, eSourcing adoption is really still allocated to procurement professionals who are proactive, companies who are proactive, and strategic activities. The majority of sourcing activities, unfortunately, are still done via email. So we are really focused on user adoption and getting more people to use it. Our biggest competitor is, in fact, email, and it's one of it's nuts, and it's one of the drivers that we developed, or we've just developing Quick Quotes, which is a quotation portal, which is the ability for anyone in the organization to run a quick quote to try and close that loop off with low value tenders. So sourcing for strategic projects is getting more and more popular, but still a lot of these projects are done via email. But the smaller procurement activities are definitely all via email. So we're trying to close that loop and move procurement to the 21st century. I mean, I'd love to say I'd love to say that we should be talking about AI and machine intelligence and all that, but to cut to the chase, unless we can get the basics right within procurement, you can't talk about machine learning, you can't talk about deep learning, you can't talk about AI. So the drive in procurement really has to be around adoption of the basic data, because without the basic data, you can't make really important decisions.
So we shouldn't worry that procurement profession is at the risk of extinction, because so far it's not. We're not talking about machine learning or AI, but still we are fixing the basic. Or?
Yeah, you can't talk about these other areas. You can't make the inferences without actually having the basic data, and the majority of all that data is contained with people's emails. Is not centralized. It's deleted when people leave the organization. All that experience that everyone has within an organization is just absorbed into these little areas. I mean, if you talk about salespeople, they use a CRM system. If you talk about finance people, they use a finance system. Procurement people, where's my email? and there's this whole question in procurement about, I'm not sure whether I should mandate the tools for procurement. Well, okay, we've tried a carrot for long enough. Maybe we should mandate these tools, because I tell you what, salespeople are mandated to use a CRM or they can't forecast properly. Finance people are mandated to use the finance systems or the organization can't function. And the same should be true for procurement, but it's not. And that's kind of some of the changes we need to work upon.
So tell me, if I ask you a little bit visionary question, maybe challenging you a little bit, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, start with saying, I have a dream. How would the future of procurement look like?
Well, that's very interesting. So, I guess you should really say the future of procurement. We need to understand what procurement do.
Okay.
So, procurement do a wide variety of things. They have the operational focus, first of all. They have a strategic focus. They look inwards towards stakeholders within the company, and they look outwards towards suppliers. And there's a lot of talk about procurement disappearing in 20 years, etc. But it depends what you define by procurement. If you're talking pure operational procurement, I need to go and buy something. I'm in the organization. Is there a contract? Where do I do that? I think at the moment we already see a move of people doing that outside of procurement, and that's quite normal.
Yeah.
If you're talking about strategic annual requirements to create contracts, to input into kind of P2P systems, then there's the challenge in moving that to kind of a time when that could disappear. You need a lot of intelligence to be able to understand all the data, to understand what service level requirements, to communicate with the stakeholders, to communicate with the suppliers. There's a lot of human work involved with that, which it'd be very difficult to see how it's kind of like sales. Can you eliminate the interpersonal relationship? That would be very challenging for that to disappear. That's not to say that it couldn't be driven by more market-led intelligence. I think that's for sure. If you talk about the other kind of areas such as supplier information management, there's certainly a lot of that which could be automated around, what suppliers are at risk in terms of the supply chain, from the shape of your supply chain, from the geography. But there's other elements of that area which would be very difficult to disappear. For example, around, reviews with suppliers, understanding how you could innovate together, understanding how, you can work that, you could help each other out. So I think the future of procurement, there are elements obviously which will become more automated, but what that should do is free up time for you to work with suppliers on a more strategic level, to work with your stakeholders on a more strategic level, a more innovative level. And I think that's where procurement should focus more on the upstream activities instead of the down. So I think that's where, but I don't really buy into procurement disappearing, because you need interpersonal relationships as much as salespeople. But I think you'll see the focus on more the upstream activities. Having said that, it's still, as I say, 20 years on, people are still using email for the majority of activities. And people want to say, you talk to like CPOs, etc. You say, well, we'd like to hear about all this great stuff, but in fact, how do we get the basics right first?
I like it. And I like the way how you separated the activities. Of course, some of the activities are becoming more and more automated, and you can outsource some services to more efficient companies, or even to cloud solutions or whatever. But some of the things I like you described that will still require some human intelligence, at least for a few more years.
Unless you get the kind of person, the machine acting like the human. It's exactly. It's all about relationships, isn't it? People buy from people, know, like, trust, buy. You need to. There's a lot of, obviously we sell auctions, which are relatively, not very personal. No. But it doesn't mean that afterwards you can't have these discussions on the, involving human relationships, because it's business after all, and you need that.
Interesting. We will come back to e-auctions to reverse auctions in a while, but maybe to wrap up the topic about the future of procurement, if we talk then about with the value for our listeners, if you can think about few advice about the let's say skills and soft and hard skills that procurement professionals can develop to be ready for to meet the future in a good way and to be on top of the agenda of what's going on. What would it be? What would you say?
Oh. Well, I mean, if you break it down once again to something like people, processes, and technology, first of all, you need technology which is fit for purpose, that allows you to advance into the next stage and become more efficient. In terms of the processes, I'm a believer that we should, if the more proactive younger generation tend to adopt these technologies more easily, but once not recently I had a change from our CRM application which was forced upon me by the CRM provider. I'm not a Luddite by any means, but I resisted the change because I was just getting on with my work. When the change came in, I was like, oh, I don't like this interface, this is terrible, not as good as the past. But after 2 months, you don't know the difference. And that's the same with all technologies. I think on the process side, we need some kind of drive towards using these technologies. In terms of the people side, I think a lot of skills can be learned. I think procurement's got to attract more motivated, proactive people at the times who are willing to make the change and want to drive the more strategic sense. I think the kind of skills that procurement people are learning seem to be the right one. It's more being able to free up their time from the reactive elements such as invoice chasing through to the proactive elements of supplier collaboration, for example.
Interesting. Yeah, I like it a lot.
Thank you.
Then if we and very practical, and I think for each of our listeners, it's very practical advice. So keep on developing, keep on learning, take the changes with enthusiasm. Don't be resistant. Right.
Absolutely. The everything out there exists at the moment to improve your procurement function. I recently was aghast when I spoke to a particular procurement director, and she'd asked about what the team of our R&D team actually, what value procurement bring, and she was told that they don't bring any value. And I think that's the challenge with procurement. What value do they bring, and how to demonstrate that to the organization? I mean, if you are told to buy some coffee and you just go and buy some coffee, then you haven't necessarily added value. However, the role of procurement in today's organization is either to buy the same coffee for less, or buy a better brand, or reduce the risk of working with suppliers. I love the analogy when you save like 1% in procurement, you add 10% to the bottom line, because effectively you need less salespeople. And a lot of people seem to focus on procurement in times of recession, but I think that's all wrong. People should focus on procurement all the time.
Yeah, exactly. Great. Super. Then if we come to the core area of your expertise, and here maybe we'll go a little bit deeper in eSourcing, and if you can say in to begin with about eSourcing, when it is absolutely necessary and when it is maybe not the best idea to use eSourcing. Do you have any how to distinguish this?
I would okay, I'm going to be a bit biased, but I will say eSourcing should be used all the time. eSourcing is simply capturing the information in an electronic tool. And I think the question is, are the tools fit for purpose to use eSourcing for all sizes of procurement activity? And I think if you look out there, it's something we drive ourselves on. I think, yes, we are there and thereabouts there. I think there are obviously improvements to be made, but if you're talking a small tender activity or a large tender activity or strategic one, eSourcing is applicable. I mean, if you talk about Pareto analysis on organizational spend, obviously 80% of the spend is on 20% of your kind of categories. But you've got an awful lot of spend out there which needs to be understood, and if you can't understand it, you can't tackle it. So I would actually say that there is nothing which should exist outside of an eSourcing kind of remit, with eSourcing being simply a centralized tool, electronic tool, where you can store the information and work more efficiently.
Okay, now I need to paraphrase my question. I get your point, and maybe this is the question about the general understanding. What do we mean by eSourcing then? Then can you start with this one, elaborating what do you consider when you say eSourcing? Is it like all scope of activities, not only e-auctions or e-tendering?
Well, e-sourcing would be e-tendering. So when I say e-sourcing, I'd refer to it as anything from an ERFX, and the ERFX might be an RFQ, an RFP, an RFI, through to auctions.
All right. So if we talk about, let's take two examples. Let's say we are a factory, the manufacturing company, and we have the direct and indirect procurement departments. And I mean, how can these two benefit from e-sourcing? Probably there is some difference, right? If we are talking about the direct material, for example, and if we are talking about some things connected to indirect categories.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me that question, and I promise any listeners there that we didn't prime you at all. We're actually working. There's a small manufacturing company based in Norfolk who are using Market Dojo for I had a call from the director, and he wanted to use Market Dojo for the direct and indirect procurement. And his real challenge was on the direct side. He wasn't. He found that the people there, they call the suppliers, they chase them up, they expedite them, and then the efficiency issues where you couldn't get the you couldn't go out to 10 suppliers because it was too much work. So actually that company now is using Market Dojo for all their direct procurement activities, and the gentleman there realized that there was a huge opportunity in small manufacturing firms in the UK that have no e-sourcing, no electronic tendering procedures, no auctions. They just don't do it. It's kind of a lot of the companies in the past have been aimed at the large multinationals. And so actually we've developed a joint venture with this company called, I can actually tell you the name now, it's called Bonfire, BOM, for bill of materials. We're going to release it in February, and it's going to be a very guided buying system for the procurement of raw materials for any SME. So essentially, we're going to have any small manufacturing company, in fact, any company at all, can go onto this marketplace to very easily procure raw materials. So things like I'm going to buy steel, bar, 20 mil diameter, get me a quote. So we're using Market Dojo as the engine, but we've got a very kind of guided buying interface. And the point being is that e-sourcing is being used in for that particular area to procure one of the most strategic items for an SME in manufacturing, and that's obviously saving the company. He reckons that saves the company a ridiculous amount of effort in time and expediting and resource he could place elsewhere. And now he's looking to drive all his procurement activities through an e-sourcing platform. I think the challenge companies find is that sometimes you don't want to use a sledgehammer to crack a nut, which is why we're developing things like quick quotes. So the interface is much easier for the very small value items for people who aren't used to using these type of tools.
So for the manufacturing company, as if we come back, buying paper or coffee or things like this, you would use the simplified version, or
Well, that's a good question. So, and I think we need to distinguish them between e-sourcing and P2P. So,
Okay.
e-sourcing is more about obtaining the information, the quotations, and perhaps negotiating. When P2P is the procurement side. So, let's say these small manufacturing companies, if they were going to go out for an annual tender of their coffee requirements, even though there might be say £10,000, yeah, you could use our simplified quick quote portal to do this, and that's specifically why we developed this new tool, which has had it's had tremendous interest in the last few months. It's been fantastic. However, if you're talking, I'm just going to buy the coffee today, then you're probably better off using your Amazon Business, for example, because there is that. Do you get a quote or do you just buy it? I think that's the question. I think whenever you've got an element where there's, I need to go out and get that information, get the quotation, to store them centrally, prove that I've done a proper procurement job. That's when you'd use e-sourcing rather than just buy it on a P2P system.
Interesting. And maybe to finalize all my, not to say doubts, but the challenges that I had with e-sourcing and I keep on having is connected to, let's call it requirements to the products or services, how to make sure that each participant of quotation or of this tender understand the requirements in the same way using the e-sourcing. I mean, is it possible without physical meetings or without some Skype meetings or WebEx to really align with each of the participants? And what is the best practice maybe in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And the answer to that question is very simple. Look, I mean, e-sourcing is in fact no different what people do at the moment with email. So I think sometimes people can look at e-sourcing as, it sounds very difficult. I'm not sure about it. It's no different from the process carried out, which we've done for thousands of years, but it's doing it in an electronic format. So the question I kind of pose back to you is, well, if you were doing this via email, how would you define what it is you're buying? How would you work out which suppliers are involved? How would you work out that those suppliers are fit for purpose? Because the answer is absolutely no different. It's just that e-sourcing does it in a more managed, secure, and centralized way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's as the answer is as simple as that. It's not doing anything special. It's doing it in a more efficient, better way.
So still for the very important contracts, for the big agreements, frame agreements, you still recommend, if before we were making the physical meetings or some activities on supplier side, visiting few suppliers who participate the RFP, for example, and with e-sourcing, it's still similar process. I mean, in terms of physical meetings, if it's needed, right?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the tender. We have some people who run tenders with like 500 suppliers. We have some people run tenders for £100 million tenders, in which case that was actually a meat tender I was thinking on there. But the point being is, in those kind of tenders, hey, you'll negotiate the market price first, and then you'll do supplier qualification. Other companies will do the supplier qualification up front and only have suppliers involved in the tender activity who satisfy X, Y, and Z. So it kind of depends on the category and the company and the structure and the strategic element to it. So it might work both ways. But again, the process would be no different to how that would be carried out via email and face-to-face.
Nice. Okay, so I think we demystified many fears and challenges and myth about the e-sourcing, and I like also very much your approach that it is about, and also you mentioned about succession, better succession when the things are changing from one specialist to another specialist when people are leaving. I think it's very, very powerful. This I didn't actually think about. It's a side effect, but which is very, very important.
It's nuts. We speak to clients and they say they run to IT departments when someone leaves and ask them to stop the inbox being deleted because it's got 5 years of procurement history in it.
Interesting. Exactly. This should not be underestimated. Fully agree. Really nice. And maybe one more topic, Alan, if you don't mind, for especially for the listeners who have never done it before. Can you elaborate about reverse auctions? And maybe starting from the very, very basic, what it is, step by step, and what is the best practice, or what are the hints from your side, running so many of them, I'm sure. And what can you recommend how to make it in the best way? But starting from the basic.
Yeah, so again, let's not wrap auctions up in mystery. Auctions are a part of eSourcing process that you may or may not go to. You normally wouldn't approach a category with a view to doing any auction at the very beginning. You may or may not, but you don't need to do that. Essentially, you'll carry out a sourcing process, and at the end of it, you may carry out an auction. A reverse auction is a means of negotiating with suppliers. So you will ask the suppliers over maybe half an hour to bid to supply you with goods or services. They will put bids in, for example, and maybe see their rank. And the objective over that potentially half hour is to see the price come down. And at the end of the auction, if you've got a lot of suppliers in there, in other words, supplier liquidity, you'll hopefully something what we call as the market price. So you might get one supplier who's misunderstood something. Hopefully you've weeded them out before you get there. But generally you see a bunch of suppliers around the same price. And then what you can do is you can have a buyer's choice auction, which the majority of our clients run, and they can choose to take those top 3 suppliers to have a discussion over the kind of more fluffy areas afterwards. So there's a lot of objections around destroy supplier relationships, when in truth it actually strengthens them. It's more open, it's more transparent. Auctions are very open and honest ways of negotiating. To run an auction properly, you also need to define your SLAs, service level agreements, much more before an auction starts, and that can actually help the suppliers a lot. So we have clients who run, our very first auction was run by someone who'd never run an auction. She ran an auction on £20,000 worth of factory consumables with a local supplier base, and she saved 25% of the consumables, and that paid for an annual license. And we have people who run auctions on hundreds of £1 million worth of items. We have a company called Greco who do auctions every day on freight, and spot tender their freight through auctions. So auctions shouldn't be approached with any kind of mysticism. They're just a way to negotiate. They're a tool to use at the right point in time. And if you have a good specification of service level agreements, if you have liquidity on the market, in other words, suppliers who want to bid, then you're very likely to have a successful auction. The key points to running any kind of auction tender is when you approach the category, you approach it sensibly, you approach it from a way of collecting information and mitigating risk all through the process. Nice. So actually, by the time you get to the auction, it's no surprise that it's going to be successful. And if you have challenges such as low supplier liquidity, there are types of auction you can use to mitigate this.
Interesting. And I think you have covered it really, really nicely. But in bullet points, your recommendation is, you said limited in time, and I like half an hour. Before I was having like 1-2 hours was typical, 2 hours. Okay, you said about liquidity of suppliers base, and what was your recommendation there?
Yeah, the easiest way to run an auction is if you have a very defined SLA, very defined specs, and you have very good supplier liquidity. And that's the easiest way. You run a ranked auction, you get good interaction, get great results. In fact, the majority of our clients run auctions which are 15 minutes in length with a 1-minute dynamic close. Nice. Now, if you have other challenges, if you were to ask me what category you could do an auction, which one you couldn't, in fact, there is no hard and fast rule. We have people who run auctions on management consultancy services by making a blended rate. It's true that some categories present more challenges than others, but similarly, you might have a very commoditized category, but you've only just negotiated it, 6 months ago. So there's no point doing an auction on it there and then unless something's changed. So there's no hard and fast rule to what's suitable. But you just have to approach it in an organized way. Definition and SLAs and liquidity are the most important things to make a success. Keep it short and sweet. Don't run it on a Friday night at 5 p.m. You need to be mindful of the suppliers taking part. Don't forget, it's a chance to sell your organization. And you can mitigate risk by obtaining pre-bids, for example. If you obtain a load of pre-bids from suppliers before the auction starts, you know where you're going to start from. If before an auction starts, you've got a load of pre-bids and they're all over the place, and the suppliers have obviously misunderstood specifications, you can start using them to mitigate your risk. If you just go, I'm going to run an auction and run it the next day, you're at a greater risk of that auction not succeeding in providing you the success you want. So it's all about planning, just like any process.
Exactly. And also two more takeaways from what you said was about being careful not breaking the relationship that you have probably established with some of the suppliers or with many of them. So this is one thing you said, being mindful of that. And second thing of that was connected to maybe having kind of a separate round with the, so to say, selected amount of suppliers where you clarify if everybody understood it correctly and if it's not mistake or whatever.
Yeah, it's very important to do that. I mean, in terms of supplier relationships, look, I mean, initially a lot of suppliers might balk at the idea of e-auctions, but we found that after time they do get to, there is a lot they get from them and can really like them. There are opportunities for business. Obviously, the incumbent might not see it quite that way, but generally we get very high engagement and suppliers. In some ways, the transparency and honesty of auctions are also their Achilles heels, because lots of suppliers are used to tenders where they submit their information, hear nothing more, don't get the business, and they're happy with that. They run you run an auction, suppliers find out they're fifth, they put their best price in and they go, I don't believe that, this is rubbish. But in fact, they've got a lot more from it. And the fact that they're fifth in the market, they may like it or not, but that's the fact of life, and they need to address that if they're going to become more competitive. So it actually works in favor of strengthening a lot of relationships. It also forces the buyer to make sure they nail the SLAs and the specs, because you can't run an auction on price alone, for example, with kind of a woolly understanding about what's being offered.
Very powerful point. And I also was having few of consultancy with the suppliers, actually with the companies who were like having their sales personnel to have the training with me and like putting in the sales shoes on, so to say, and the sales department shoes on. I think what you said is very, very important, that these e-auctions were really not preferred by them just because of this feeling of stress and feeling of like not being able to negotiate as they normally do and things like that. But in the end, it's really fact-based. It shows you your position on the market, if all the specifications are correct and understood clearly by everybody. So it really can be a cold shower, but it's better than a sweet denial, right?
Oh, absolutely. And a lot of our clients run auctions on a buyer's choice basis. So as I say, the lowest bid is kind of seen as preferable, but they will bring the top three in to have a chat with afterwards to make sure they've understood the specs, the SLAs, and what else can be offered. So it's not necessarily the end of the process. We've been involved in auctions ourselves for our auction tool. Weirdly enough, it wasn't using our platform. And they're not as random as some people may think. There are strategies you can use to place to win an auction, or don't forget, an auctions are there's a hint for suppliers. Auctions are about a show as well, so you need to be able to show the buyer a willingness to take part. You need to show you might have a room of stakeholders. You shouldn't bid and hold numbers, because you're more likely to have an equal position as another supplier. You should always have your BATNA in there. You should have strategies for how you defeat someone who's shadowing your bids, for example. So, even though an auction might just be an auction, there's a lot of strategy suppliers can use to their advantage. And I think that's very important.
Fantastic advice. I'm really, really thankful for you saying it was from your perspective, and I think for many of our listeners it's really, really powerful insights from this discussion with you. And now, Alan, honestly, time flies, and coming to the end of our podcast episode, I ask my guests to give some practical advice to our listeners, some big ideas.
Wow, I'm not sure I think I could come up with anything. You put me on the spot there. I'm not sure I could come up with anything new. I'm kind of banging the same old drum. I think data is the key in society today. Big data, any data allows you to make decisions, faster decisions, more educated decisions, move to, say, machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence. And I would challenge procurement departments out there who are using email. I would challenge them as to why wouldn't you, maybe short amount of time, challenge them to try and move away from that. Tell, maybe even enforce, maybe even mandate users to use a system. And I would say that the benefits they would receive from security, from data centralization, from savings will be huge once they apply using eSourcing systems as salespeople would use CRM systems. And that would be the challenge I'd put to the wider audience, and not just for a few strategic categories, but for as much as possible. And that would be my advice would be to question why that driver hasn't been more mandated or uptaken by the organization.
Really good advice, really interesting. And it still comes back a little bit to where we started about the future of our profession and about the future of procurement. And thank you so much for your thoughts, your ideas, being just after so important meeting that you had, and having so nice and so great, insightful discussion. Thank you for your time.
Absolute pleasure, and a happy new year to everyone as well.
Thank you so much for being with us until the very end of this episode. Today we were talking to Alun Rafique from Market Dojo, and we were discussing eSourcing. And as a special bonus for you, dear listener, I asked Alan to share a piece of content about reverse auction. It will be a beginner's guide about reverse auction, and here you will see the history and the background of reverse auction, what it is, and you will understand where and how to use reverse auction. You will have the process of reverse auctions in it, step by step, and also you will see some case studies where you will see how to apply it in real life. And I'm really sure that you will like this piece of content, because I really did like it. So go in the description, in the show note, and you will find the link to download this nice piece of content for yourself. My name is Robert Freeman, and this was Future Procurement. Talk to you soon.